In the spring of 1943, the sky over the Kuban was a killing ground. Below, the Black Sea glimmered in the distance. Above, hundreds of fighters twisted through cloud and smoke. Engines screamed. Tracer rounds stitched across the air. A Soviet pilot named Alexander Pokryshkin pushed his throttle forward and climbed into the fight. He was flying an aircraft built not in Moscow.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Not in Leningrad, but in Buffalo by the Bell Aircraft Company. The fighter was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. Many American and British pilots had already dismissed the P-39. They said it was flawed. They said it was too slow at high altitude. They said removing its turbo supercharger had crippled its performance. Some considered it a second-rate aircraft. Yet on this day, one of the Soviet Union's most dangerous fighter pilots trusted his life to it. Within minutes, Pokryshkin would shoot down another German aircraft. Then, another. And over the next 2 years, he and many of the Soviet Union's greatest aces would turn this controversial American fighter into one of the deadliest aircraft on the Eastern Front. That is the mystery at the heart of this story. Why did so many of the Soviet Union's top fighter aces choose to fly an American plane that the West often underestimated? Why did nearly half of the Soviet Union's highest-scoring pilots achieve many of their victories in the P-39? And how did a fighter that struggled to impress some Allied air forces become a legend in Soviet hands? To understand the answer, you have to go back to the darkest days of 1941. On 22 June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. More than 3 million German and Axis troops crossed into Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields with devastating force. Thousands of Soviet aircraft were destroyed, many on the ground. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Entire aviation regiments were shattered. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival. Factories were being dismantled and moved east beyond the Ural Mountains. Pilots often flew outdated aircraft like the Polikarpo First-16 against more modern German fighters such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109. Soviet industry would eventually recover, but in 1941 and 1942, every aircraft mattered. The United States had not yet entered the war when it began supplying aid to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Tanks, trucks, locomotives, food, radios, aluminum, and aircraft began flowing east. Among these aircraft was the Bell P-39 Airacobra. The P-39 was unlike any fighter of its time. Its Allison engine sat behind the pilot rather than in the nose. A long shaft ran beneath the cockpit to drive the propeller. The design gave the aircraft a distinctive shape and allowed Bell to mount a powerful 37 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. In the nose and wings, machine guns added even more firepower. One short burst could destroy a fighter or cripple a bomber. The aircraft also had car-style side doors instead of a sliding canopy. Pilots stepped into the cockpit like entering an automobile. The tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel gave it modern handling on the ground. It looked futuristic, almost experimental. But the P-39 had one major weakness. Early prototypes included a turbo supercharger that would have given strong high-altitude performance. During development, the turbo system was removed to simplify production and reduce weight. Without it, the Allison engine performed best at lower altitudes. Above roughly 15,000 feet, performance dropped sharply. This limitation frustrated the Royal Air Force, which needed high-altitude fighters to intercept German aircraft over Britain. The RAF tested the Airacobra and used it only briefly. The United States Army Air Forces employed the P-39 in some theaters, especially in the Pacific, but it never became as famous as the Lockheed P-38 Lightning or the North American P-51 Mustang. For the Soviet Union, however, the situation was different. Most air combat on the Eastern Front took place at medium and low altitudes. German fighters often escorted bombers attacking troops, bridges, and artillery positions close to the front. Soviet pilots rarely needed to fight at the very high altitudes common over Western Europe. What looked like a fatal weakness in one theater became far less important in another. The first P-39s arrived in the Soviet Union in late 1942. Some came through the dangerous Arctic convoys to ports like Murmansk. Others traveled along the Alsab route, flown from Alaska across Siberia to frontline units. Still more arrived through Iran. Each aircraft represented an extraordinary international journey before ever meeting the enemy. At first, Soviet pilots were cautious. Many had learned not to trust unfamiliar equipment. Some foreign aircraft supplied under Lend-Lease were useful, but others were less suited to Eastern Front conditions. The P-39 looked strange. Its engine behind the pilot seemed unsettling. The heavy cannon was unusual. Spin characteristics could be dangerous if mishandled. Then pilots began flying combat missions. They quickly discovered several advantages. The cockpit offered excellent visibility. The radio equipment was often superior to that found in many Soviet-built fighters of the early war. The aircraft was sturdy. The tricycle landing gear improved takeoff and landing, especially for less experienced pilots. Most importantly, the concentrated nose-mounted firepower was devastating. Soviet doctrine increasingly emphasized short, accurate bursts at close range. Pilots were trained to get near before firing. In those conditions, the 37 mm cannon was terrifying. A single hit could tear apart a Bf-109 or Focke-Wulf W-190. Even if the cannon missed, the machine guns could still inflict serious damage. No pilot understood the P-39 better than Alexander Pokryshkin. Born in Novosibirsk, Pokryshkin was not merely a skilled flyer. He was a thinker. He studied every mission, analyzed mistakes, and challenged outdated tactics. Early in the war, Soviet fighter doctrine often relied on rigid formations that limited flexibility. Pokryshkin wanted something different. Flying the P-39, he found the perfect tool for his ideas. He emphasized altitude advantage, coordinated attacks, disciplined radio communication, and aggressive teamwork. His famous tactical concept, often summarized as altitude, speed, maneuver, fire, transformed how Soviet fighter units operated. The P-39's good acceleration, strong low-altitude performance, and heavy armament fit this approach perfectly. During the Kuban air battles from April to June 1943, Pokryshkin and his comrades fought some of the most intense air battles of the war. The Luftwaffe deployed experienced units to support German forces in the Caucasus. The sky became crowded with fighters, dive bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Sometimes dozens of aircraft engaged at once. Pokryshkin's regiment, the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, used the P-39 to deadly effect. He shot down numerous German aircraft and became a national hero. His success was not an isolated case. Other pilots in the regiment were also scoring heavily. One of them was Grigory Rechkalov. Rechkalov was a gifted and instinctive pilot with exceptional eyesight. He achieved many of his victories in the P-39 and eventually became one of the highest-scoring Soviet aces of the war. Though his relationship with Pokryshkin was sometimes strained, both men demonstrated what the Airacobra could do. Another future ace was Nikolai Gulaev. Bold and aggressive, Gulaev became known for his extraordinary rate of victories. He too scored heavily while flying the P-39. In some periods, he shot down enemy aircraft at a remarkable pace. Then there was Dmitry Glinka and his brother Boris Glinka. Both became famous in P-39s. Their aircraft often carried distinctive markings, and their names were known throughout the Soviet Air Force. As more elite units received the Airacobra, a pattern emerged. The aircraft repeatedly appeared in the records of the Soviet Union's top scorers. By war's end, a striking share of the highest-ranking Soviet aces had flown the P-39 for many of their victories. The reasons went beyond firepower. The P-39 was comfortable. This mattered more than many people realize. Pilots sometimes flew several sorties a day. A better seat, clearer instruments, and more reliable radios reduced fatigue and improved combat effectiveness. The aircraft's enclosed cockpit offered a practical and efficient workspace rather than a crude compromise. Soviet ground crews also grew to appreciate the Airacobra. Mechanics found it accessible and robust when properly maintained. They adapted quickly, learning how to keep the American engines and systems running in harsh conditions. Spare parts arrived through Lend-Lease, and technical experience spread from regiment to regiment. The Soviet Union did make modifications. Pilots and mechanics adjusted equipment, changed weapon configurations in some cases, and developed maintenance practices suited to frontline realities. But the essential aircraft remained the same. The key difference was how it was employed. In Western discussions, the P-39 was often judged against the needs of escort missions over Germany, where fighters had to perform well above 25,000 feet. On the Eastern Front, combat frequently occurred far lower. Here, the Airacobra's strengths were fully available while its biggest weakness was less significant. German pilots learned to respect the aircraft. A P-39 diving from above with an experienced Soviet ace at the controls was a serious threat. Its concentrated nose armament meant the pilot did not need to worry about converging wing guns. If the target filled the gun sight, even a brief burst could be fatal. The aircraft also suited Pokryshkin's tactical philosophy. He wanted disciplined formations, vertical maneuver, and coordinated attacks. Superior radio communication allowed leaders to direct the fight in real time. This was a major advantage over earlier Soviet aircraft, many of which had unreliable or limited radios. By 1944, the Soviet Air Force was no longer fighting simply to survive. It was gaining air superiority in many sectors. New domestic fighters like the Yakovlev Yak-3, Yakovlev Yak-9, and Lavochkin La-5 were excellent. Yet the P-39 remained highly valued, especially among experienced units. This is one of the most telling facts in the story. Soviet pilots were not forced to praise the Airacobra because they lacked alternatives. By 1944, they had several capable home-built fighters. Many top aces still preferred the P-39 because they trusted it. Pokryshkin ultimately became the second highest-scoring Soviet ace, credited with 59 individual victories by the official Soviet count, with some historians suggesting higher totals. He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. The P-39 was central to his wartime legend. Rechkalov finished with 56 official victories. Gulaev was credited with 57. Dmitry Glinka reached 50. Many of these scores were achieved while flying the Airacobra. Together they formed a remarkable concentration of elite pilots around one American-built aircraft. The Soviet Union received more than 4,700 P-39s, making it by far the largest foreign operator of the type. For many regiments, the Airacobra became a familiar and trusted machine rather than an exotic import. Its role extended beyond statistics. The P-39 arrived at a critical moment. In 1942 and 1943, the Soviet Union was transitioning from desperate defense to increasingly effective offensive operations. An aircraft that combined strong armament, good radios, and solid low-altitude performance gave skilled pilots exactly what they needed. There were still dangers. The P-39 could enter a flat spin if mishandled, especially if weight distribution was affected. Pilots needed proper training and respect for the aircraft's characteristics. Soviet aces mastered these risks through experience and discipline. The Airacobra also had psychological value. Pilots often develop deep confidence in certain aircraft. Confidence changes combat behavior. A pilot who trusts his machine attacks more decisively, maintains focus under pressure, and takes advantage of fleeting opportunities. The Soviet aces who loved the P-39 believed it would do what they asked of it. This confidence was earned in battle after battle over the Kuban, Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Romania, and eventually Germany itself. The same aircraft that some had dismissed kept appearing in victory reports. The story also reveals a larger truth about military technology. Weapons are not inherently good or bad in isolation. Their value depends on environment, tactics, logistics, and the people using them. The P-39 was not universally ideal. It was exceptionally well matched to Soviet needs. When historians compare famous fighters, attention often goes to aircraft with glamorous reputations. The Spitfire defended Britain. The Mustang escorted bombers to Berlin. The Yak-3 dazzled with agility, yet the P-39 occupies a unique place. It crossed oceans and continents to fight in a theater for which it seemed unexpectedly suited, and there it helped create legends. By late 1944 and 1945, newer fighters increasingly took center stage, but the Airacobra's reputation among Soviet veterans remained strong. Pokryshkin himself continued to speak highly of it after the war. For him, it was not a second-best solution. It was a superb combat aircraft when used correctly. In museums today, a P-39 wearing Soviet markings can seem almost surprising. The design is unmistakably American. The red stars on its wings tell a different story. It is a symbol of a wartime partnership built under enormous pressure, when factories, convoys, and pilots were linked across half the world. Imagine a crate leaving an American factory floor. It travels by rail to a port, crosses submarine-infested seas or icy wilderness, is assembled by Soviet mechanics, and finally roars into combat over the Eastern Front. Days later, a skilled pilot uses it to shoot down a German fighter. That chain of events was repeated thousands of times. So why did half of the Soviet Union's top fighter aces fly the American P-39? Because the aircraft matched the battlefield. Because most Eastern Front air combat took place where the Airacobra performed best. Because its cannon and machine guns hit with overwhelming force. Because its radios and cockpit gave pilots better control. Because Soviet mechanics learned to maintain it. Because innovators like Pokryshkin developed tactics that exploited every strength it offered. And above all, because great pilots recognized a great opportunity. They did not care that some Western airmen considered the P-39 flawed. They cared whether it could climb fast enough, turn hard enough, communicate clearly, and destroy the enemy with one accurate burst. In their hands, the answer was yes. On that spring day over the Kuban in 1943, Pokryshkin banked through smoke and sunlight in his Airacobra. Somewhere ahead, another German fighter crossed his gun sight. He pressed the trigger. The cannon fired. The target broke apart. In that instant, the argument was settled not by reputation, but by results. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was an American aircraft that found its true destiny in Soviet service. It helped some of the greatest fighter pilots of the war reach legendary status. It proved that the right machine in the right hands can rewrite history. And that is why, when you study the scoreboards of the Soviet Union's top aces, one foreign fighter appears again and again. Not the Mustang, not the Spitfire, the Airacobra.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.